Hey Crawlspace listeners, this is part 2 of our Bennington Triangle series. Again, this aired on Missing back in the summer, and we're once again joined by our friend, archives librarian from Worcester State University, Ross Griffiths. And this is only part 2 of 6, so we hope you enjoy this. And this case that we're going to be speaking about today is about Paula Welden. We're talking about Paula Welden's disappearance that seems a little more mysterious than Mitty Rivers. What do you think?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I just want to let the listeners know, Tim and I were present during this conversation, but Ross is so good that he goes into storytelling mode. So it's the Ross Griffiths show, without question. He has, like you said, all of the answers are already answered in his head. We just had to ask a couple. He goes through the story in this amazing way that is going to keep you captivated the entire time. And the mystery is captivating, Tim. Like you said, this is more mysterious than Mitty Rivers. Because Mitty Rivers, I think his disappearance could be attributed to something that was more internal for him. But we can get into this during the final thoughts that we're going to be doing at the end of this episode. Whereas Paula Welden, there's other factors and other people that are coming into play here that could have been responsible for this now legendary Bennington Triangle story.
Yeah, and Paula was just 18 years old on December 1st, 1946, when she went missing hiking the Long Trail in Vermont. She was a student at Bennington College, and she went missing without a trace, and there were several sightings of her on that long trail, which is, I guess, fortunate because at least it can rule out the idea that she disappeared on campus or somewhere else, you know. At least we know that she made it to the long trail, and searches were extensive, but they never found a trace. So we discussed this story with Ross, and I hope you enjoy this case. You can submit a tip to the Vermont State Police. We'll have a link in the show notes to be able to do that. Or you could text keyword VTIPS to 274637.
All right, so settle in, everybody. You are about to hear the full story of the disappearance of Paula Welden in the Bennington Triangle with our friend Ross Griffiths.
Welcome back to the podcast, Ross Griffiths. Ross, how are you today?
I'm doing great. Happy to be here.
Yes, it's great to have you here. It's great to have you return. We decided that we wanted to do a series of these episodes on the Bennington Triangle, a lot of mystery that is happening in this particular region. And you're nearly at a point where there's no introduction necessary. I feel like a lot of the listeners know who you are, but for those who don't, can you give a little brief background on yourself and what brings you to the show?
I'm Ross Griffiths. I am archives librarian at Worcester State University. I have an interest in some of these older cold cases, true crime cases, things from the past. And one of my areas of interest is comparing fact and folklore. I like the ways in which you can kind of look at primary sources and discern the ways that stories change over time from how they were originally told. And that happened a lot with the Bennington Triangle case, for sure.
Yeah, it definitely happens with this group of disappearances that are kind of bunched together to sort of form this Bennington Triangle. And so today we're here to talk about the second chronologically. It's Paula Welden who went missing. Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about her disappearance?
Sure. And this is an intimidating case to talk about because some people have described Paula Welden as like the Laura Palmer of the Bennington Triangle cases. Not that she was ever found, but that she is really the center of fascination with these cases. And her disappearance really haunted the region for many, many years. And a lot of people have written about the Welden case, including researchers who had access to materials that I have not had access to. And so the case has been covered a great deal. I'm going to really try to do it justice by providing a summary of what media reports had to say, which are easily accessible on newspaper databases, but also to touch on what some of these researchers have talked about who accessed the original police files. One of these researchers is Michael Dooling, who wrote a book called Clueless in New England, where he included the Welden case with a couple of other disappearances. And his research using the police files really gives us crucial insights into Paula's personality and her character, which you really can't find as much in newspaper or media accounts. So it really helps us understand who she was as a person. Paula Welden disappeared on December the 1st, 1946, from the Long Trail area outside Bennington. She, at the time, was an 18-year-old sophomore at Bennington College. She was raised in Stamford, Connecticut, which is about 160, 150 miles south of Bennington along the coast of Long Island Sound. It's really, I think, more oriented toward the New York City area than to New England or Boston. She was raised in an upper middle class family. Her father, Archibald Welden, was an industrial designer for a company called the Revere Brass Company. And they were known for creating a lot of high-end household goods back in the 30s, well into the 50s, 60s, and today. But one of the things he was involved with is developing the first generation of stainless steel cookware in the 30s, which was a very innovative kind of thing. And so she was raised in a pretty comfortable household. She had 3 sisters. When the time came for her to pick a college, she chose Bennington College, which is North Bennington, just outside Bennington town. And part of why she chose this was because it had a very strong arts focus. I mean, she was interested in art, but it was also that Bennington College at the time had a really unique program where students worked closely with a faculty advisor to develop their own course of study. And so you had to be really directed, really self-directed, and I think motivated to get through Bennington's program. And there's an interesting story that Paula Welden's roommate tells about her that I think gives us a sense of what her personality was like. During the end of her freshman year, which would have been the spring of 1946, she was trying to figure out how to ship her bicycle home from college, from Bennington down to Stamford. And her roommate said, why don't you just ride it home? So she, with reluctant permission of her parents, got permission to ride her bicycle home, the 100 plus miles to Stamford. She spent several weeks getting herself in shape by riding her bike around the hills in Bennington. And when her roommate took off on the train back home, Paula took off on her bike for this multi-day bike ride. 17 years old, 1946. This is not one of those lightweight aluminum bikes like we have today, and apparently it was a difficult journey. There was a lot of rain. But when she got to her parents' house, she talked about how all these people helped her out along the way. It was this great trip. And it was apparently this really big adventure. But I think we should pay attention to that story because I think it tells us some things about her. She was pretty daring, I think, had a spirit of adventure, but she was conscientious. She was deliberative, and she was unconventional in how she did things. And all of that together made her, I think, a good candidate for Bennington College. But I think it also may inform some of the ways we think about her disappearance as we look at what happened to her on those days leading up to December the 1st. So the fall of 1946, Paula had returned for her sophomore year. Things had changed a little bit for her. She wasn't as sure about her field of study any longer. She was a little unhappy with some of the art classes she was taking. She was thinking of switching to botany. And I get the impression that her parents weren't thrilled with her change. They weren't totally sold on her course of action with academics. Her father seemed like a very practical guy who thought college was for, getting a good job and having a career. And maybe Paula wasn't thinking as much along those lines. Maybe she was more of a free spirit. So there may have been some tension with her family. Much has been made about Paula's moods in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Depending on what resources you look at, when I read newspaper articles, it sounds like she was kind of moody and depressed for maybe a week or so before she disappeared. But the researchers who looked at the police files indicate that she'd been struggling with something for several weeks, maybe longer. Something was on her mind. She was oversleeping. She was low energy, maybe a little bit depressed, seemed to be struggling. So there was something going on with her. She wasn't quite as settled as she had been the year before. Thanksgiving of 46 was on a Thursday, and Paula elected not to go home for Thanksgiving. Some people have made some assumptions about this, that she was struggling with her family. Maybe she was, but Bennington had classes on Thanksgiving Friday. And what she told her parents was she had coursework she wanted to do. She didn't really want to travel on Thanksgiving. So she stayed around campus on Thanksgiving. She went to a square dance Thanksgiving night on campus with a boy who she had casually dated a little bit. And I don't think we should read too much in this relationship. Back when high school and college dances were big, a lot of people would have a friend of the opposite sex they would take to dances casually. A buddy. I got a sense that she and this guy were in sort of each other's friend zone, so it wasn't serious. But she went to a square dance, had a good time. Thanksgiving Friday seemed to pass without incident. Saturday, she seemed to be in a really good mood. She and her roommate sort of had a little tussle in the morning. They both worked in the school cafeteria, and Paula was delayed getting out of bed, and her roommate ended up dumping her on the floor. Push her on the floor, but they had a laugh about it. They go down, they work their shift at the cafeteria. That evening, Paula gets into a wrestling match with some of her dorm mates in the student lounge. They were into this thing they called quote unquote Indian wrestling. So it's a little bit like arm wrestling, but instead of in a seated position, you stand and you try to bring your partner down from a standing position. And the girls were doing this so late in the night, thumping and bumping, making noise. They got scolded for being too noisy. Paula goes to bed late, and then we get to Sunday morning. So Sunday's December the 1st. Her roommate said Paula awakes in kind of a bad mood, another one of her down moods. They go to the cafeteria, they work their shifts. Paula takes someone else's lunch shift, so she works through lunch. She eats her lunch. She goes back to her dorm room, maybe around 1 o'clock, 1:30. She changes into a pair of denim overalls. These are like those farmer's overalls, the bib overalls, a red winter coat with a hood and a fur-lined collar, and white sneakers. And this outfit's important because people see her wearing this. She proceeds on foot down the lane of the college out to Route 67A, which is right outside the college. And at that point, the screen kind of goes dark. Paula is not seen again on campus. She's not seen again by any of her friends. Her roommate heads back to the dorm room that afternoon. No one's around. That evening, she goes to bed. No Paula. The next morning, she gets up. Paula's bed has not been slept in. And the roommate immediately becomes concerned and notifies college authorities, because it was unlike her to miss her shift at the cafeteria, to miss her classes. She was very responsible. So they knew on Monday, December 2nd, that something was wrong. And they set into motion some of the early searches that began. When you left Bennington's campus overnight back in this day, you had to sign a book if you're going to be out past 11. Paula had not signed the book. They search the infirmary. They walk around campus. As word starts getting out, students and faculty join into this sort of informal search of campus and the areas around campus. The campus authorities notify her parents, and they're obviously very concerned. No, Paula has not come home for the weekend. She's not visiting. They eventually, on that Monday, contact the state's attorney of Bennington County. This is the guy who's the boss of the county sheriff. So he's sort of the top law enforcement guy. This is the era before Vermont had a state police force. So this kind of an event would have been handled by sort of local police who would investigate this. And as the week progresses, concern gets greater and greater. When the story hits the newspaper on Tuesday the 2nd, that's when a lot of leads shake loose, because people in town read the newspaper and start coming forward saying that they have seen Paula. They saw her on Sunday when she left campus. And from these witness statements, the police were able to put together a timeline of Paula's last known movements on that afternoon of December the 1st. We know that she left campus at probably around 2:30 in the afternoon. There were two friends of hers who drove past in a car on the college driveway who saw her. She waved to her friends. She goes out to the highway. The guys that run the gas station next to campus see her putting out her thumb to hitch a ride. Now, I want to stop for a minute and and talk about hitchhiking. Today, we understand that hitchhiking is extremely dangerous. It's an extremely stigmatized activity, so much so you never see hitchhikers anymore. I can't think of the last time I saw a hitchhiker on the highway. In 1946, in a small college town, hitchhiking was very common. It was not considered high-risk behavior. People were aware of stranger danger back then, but I think that we had a much more high-trust society. In fact, Paula and her roommate had hitchhiked quite a bit that semester. In the previous year, they traveled all over the region hitchhiking with their friends. So let's not assume that Paula is engaging in what she thinks is high-risk behavior. She's engaging in typical behavior of a college student in the 40s. She hitches a ride with a guy named Louis Knapp. And he remembers Paula for a couple of reasons. She gets in his car, and as she's getting in, she slips on the running board. Now, this is back when cars had that ledge that was kind of below the door. And that made him notice her shoes. She's wearing these tennis shoes. And she asks him where the long trail is located. And he tells her where it is. And she said, "Can you take me there?" And he said, "I can take you partway there because I live along the way." So he proceeds down the highway. He goes out to Route 9, which is that east-west highway that runs across southern Vermont, heads eastbound on Route 9, and then pulls into his driveway and lets Paula out. He goes into his house for Sunday dinner. And we know this is 3:15. His wife served Sunday dinner at 3 o'clock promptly every Sunday, and he was 15 minutes late. And the whole family remembers this. So we have her at 3:15, a couple of miles east of the Long Trail, a little bit south of college campus. Then she's spotted around 3:45 to 4 o'clock by people who live in houses near the Long Trail. Now, if you want to remember from the Midi Rivers case, the Long Trail branches off Route 9 in a northerly direction. And for a couple of miles, it goes north-north, way up into Canada, all the way over Glastenbury Mountain. But for a couple of miles north, it follows a road. It parallels a country road that's got houses on it. So people see her. She is seen walking up toward the Long Trail. 2 teenage boys who live in a house there. One of them sees her out of the window and he says to his brother, "Hey, there's a cute girl walking past. Let's go look at her." And they go out and they see her walking past. So people notice this young woman in denim pants and white sneakers and a red winter coat with a hood walking past. And she is seen 2 or 3 more times walking up the trail. And finally, at about 4:15-ish, she encounters a group of people walking down the trail. These are several men and a woman, and they'd spent the day up in the woods. And as they're walking down the trail, she's walking up and she stops them and she says, "Is this the Long Trail?" And they say yes. And she said, how far does it go?" "Oh, it goes all the way to Canada." She said, "Does it go up to Glastenbury Mountain?" "Yes, it goes up to Glastenbury Mountain." And they part company. And it's almost dusk at this point. Let's remember, it's December 1st in Vermont. And she is walking in a northerly direction on a country road, following a trail. The road eventually ends a couple miles north, turns into a trail in the woods, walking up that direction at dusk, which is a little strange. Why is she walking up there at dusk? That sighting is the last known sighting of Paula Welden, walking up toward the woods in the dark. By the end of this week, the week of December 2nd, once the police put together this timeline, there is a sense of extreme urgency because the evening of December 1st, that Sunday, a powerful cold front moved through. Now, when Paula had left campus in her winter coat and jeans and sneakers, it was cloudy and about 40 degrees. Later that night, the temperature drops to 0 and it snows. And even though this stretch of the Long Trail has hikers' shelters and houses, there's an understanding that she is not dressed for that kind of cold weather, and no one has seen her since Sunday. And if she was lost in the woods, it's pretty dire. And there is sort of this sense of, I think, anxiety, and in some cases, you might say despair on the part of her family at this point, because their daughter's been gone for all these days. Campus has canceled classes at this point, and all the faculty and students are busy searching. Some of the women stay back behind on campus. A lot of the guys go down to the Long Trail. A lot of students from Williams College, which is a men's college over at the border in Massachusetts, they come up and aid the search. Paula's father is walking along the trail. So there's this very, very large search party, similar to the search party for Mitty Rivers, of people scouring the trail, scouring the areas around the trail, trying to find Paula Welden. And as the days progress, it becomes more and more clear that she's probably not on the trail. And there are a couple of reasons why people think this. First of all, it would be difficult to get lost on this trail, even though the trail was not well marked with signage. Where she's walking, it's a road. Don't think of a footpath in the woods. It's a road with vehicular traffic and houses. And beyond that, it's still a pretty well marked trail in the sense that it's visible. It's also in a little bit of a hollow where a creek runs through. If you went too far off the trail, you're going to be going up hills or walking in the creek. And once you're off the trail, it's brambles and saplings and rocks and really rough going. So people thought she's not lost in the woods. She didn't get lost in the woods. There was a second reason that they thought she wasn't on the trail. Had she proceeded north, she would have had to have walked across a creek, because once the public road ends and it's just a footpath, there was no bridge across the creek. And she's not wearing the kinds of shoes you would wear to walk across the creek. Her father basically stated this. Other searchers said she wouldn't have crossed this creek. Below that area, there is a secondary trail that goes in a northwesterly direction. Today, it's referred to as the Bald Mountain Trail. At the time, it was called the Blue Trail. And from the maps I've looked at, I believe these are one and the same. That trail heads in a northwesterly direction back toward the town of Bennington. And some people speculated she might have been trying to make a circle, right? She starts at Bennington, she goes south, she goes east, she goes north. Was she going northwest to try to go back out to Bennington, out to the highway, Highway 7 that runs north and south? And if she did that, was she lost in that stretch of the trail? They searched the trail, no sign of Paula. And her father said, by the time she was seen, it was almost dusk. Even if she had proceeded a little ways up that trail in the dark, she's not going to take a trail she's not familiar with in the pitch dark. She's going to circle around and go back down the trail again. But no one saw her going back down the trail again. And so her parents expressed a sense of relief that she wasn't on the trail, but that then opened the door to the theories about foul play. And the Welden case is one of the cases of these disappearances where foul play does seem like a pretty plausible theory for a couple of reasons. And we can talk about that a little bit more.
All right, we're going to take a quick break for commercial. And just a reminder, folks, that we will return at the end of this conversation with some final thoughts.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
The police were interested in interviewing people who lived along the trail, who saw her that day. Of these people, there was some interesting ones that popped out. One of them was a couple, an unknown couple, who had apparently spent the night at one of the hikers' shelters. Early that morning, this reddish-brown Mercury brand automobile was seen parked with its nose out toward the road near one of these hikers' shelters. Some people describe it as a Mercury. Some people describe it in other ways, but it was sort of a familiar brand of car. The woman who lived across from the trail had seen this couple early that morning, maybe 6 a.m. Other people saw a woman who was not Paula walking along the road. And then later in the day, a woman saw a young woman in a red coat in a vehicle with a man driving down the road. And the reason she saw these people is that her dog had walked out on the road and sat down and was blocking traffic. And she goes out to get her dog. And one of the cars that stopped is this car with the young blonde woman in a red coat with a guy. And so there was this question of, did Paula go out there to meet somebody? Was this Paula in a vehicle with a man? But as the police looked at these eyewitness statements, it didn't seem possible. This couple had been there hours and hours before Paula was there. We knew she was still back at campus. But it does open up the possibility that some of the Paula Welden sightings that day might have been this woman. So right there, we've got a little bit of confusion. Then that brings us to this guy named Fred Godet. And he has a sort of interesting role in this. It's a little bit confusing as to whether he lived full time along this road or not. But the weekend that Paula disappeared, He was apparently staying with his girlfriend, who was a Mrs. Maxwell, and her children in a residence along this road. And when the police went to the residence and asked them if they saw Paula, they said yes, but he said, oh, no, I didn't see her. I wasn't around that day. But as the police interviewed the family, it turns out he actually was around that day. Oh, but he was in Bennington. Well, he wasn't in Bennington. He was actually there on the road when Paula had disappeared. And the police finally got the straight story. At some point that afternoon, Viola Maxwell had been in the road talking to two guys in a vehicle that she knew. And Gaudette was observing this conversation. The four of them saw Paula walk past. Maxwell and Gaudette go back into the house and have a huge fight because he accuses her of having an affair. He then gets mad. He storms out of the house, gets in his car, drives off for a few minutes, and then comes back. Okay, so the police say, why did you lie to us? And they said, well, Mrs. Maxwell said, well, I'm getting a divorce and I want to keep this relationship on the down low. I don't want people to know that I'm seeing this guy. And she did, in fact, file for divorce against her husband that spring. So what she was telling was truthful, but it was kind of odd. And Mr. Gaudette comes back into this story later. So let's just put a pin in him for the moment. There were other sightings of Paula that were kind of like these red herring sightings that occur when a missing person is widely publicized throughout the region. The biggest one of these occurred in Fall River, Massachusetts, which is a long distance away from Bennington. A waitress at a diner swore that she saw Paula Welden sitting with a drunken, abusive young man who was kind of manhandling her. And she was positive. She said that this woman even asked her where Bennington was in relationship to where they were. It was such a serious lead that investigators went to Fall River with Paula's dad, and they talked to this waitress. She swore it was Paula, but after they investigated, they found out that it was mistaken identity. They actually located who this guy was, and they found out who the young woman was, and it wasn't Paula Welden. So that wasn't her. There were stories of Paula being seen in cities all around New England and the Northeast. These were all dead ends. There was this one story that a young couple told that was interesting and puzzling. They were driving down Route 9 on the evening of December the 1st. So this was the evening Paula disappeared. They were heading in an easterly direction between Bennington to Brattleboro. And when they passed the Long Trail entrance eastbound, they pulled their car over during the snowstorm to put chains on the tires. Now, this is back in the day before all-wheel drive and good all-weather tires. And so people would put chains on their tires for traction when it snowed. And when they were putting the chains on the tires, they saw footprints in the freshly fallen snow, walking in an easterly direction. And they were small footprints like those of a teenager or a young woman. And they were so curious, they followed the footprints for about 400 yards, and the footprints stopped next to a pair of tire tracks, as if someone had gotten into a car. So this really triggered a lot of buzz among investigators. The problem with this were twofold. The first was by the time the couple knew Paula was missing and reported it, the footprints were obliterated. But the second was, it was the wrong direction. If Paula had been heading back on foot back to Bennington, she would have been going to the right in a westerly direction. And these were going to the left in an easterly direction. So what do we make of that? Well, did she have hypothermia and was she disoriented and went the wrong way in the snowstorm? This was one of those clues that kind of hit a brick wall. There was nowhere else to go with it, but it was strange. It was strange. And it did, I think, feed into what Paula Welden's father thought might have happened to his daughter. And he believed that she had actually turned around, that she might have proceeded a little way up the trail after she was seen by that last group. But he thinks she turned around, she walked back down the trail and either met someone on the trail in a car who pulled over for her, or went out to the highway and hitched a ride and got a ride with a bad man. And that she didn't die on the trail, but that she essentially was kind of carried away by somebody. And so that's really where the trail dries up in this case. As with a lot of these missing persons cases, as the spring comes, the snow melts, the searches continue. Nothing is found, nothing turns up. And the family begins to accept the idea they're not going to see their daughter again. And they don't know what happened to her. That April, a bunch of people were given a lie detector test, including Maxwell, Gaudette, the boy she had gone to the square dance with, the guy she had seen on the trail that day, and a couple of other people who had seen her. They all passed the lie detector test. Their stories add up. You can take what you want about lie detector tests being reliable, but they were satisfied at the time that these people really had nothing additional to add to the case. And Paula's just not seen again after this. And so the impression I get was that a lot of the people involved in the investigation believed in foul play, either on the trail or off. And the state's attorney seemed to think that she was still up on the trail somewhere, that she had gotten lost in the woods or had gone off the trail for some reason. If she had been caught in the snowstorm, she could have become hypothermic and wandered into the woods. But I think it's important to point out one feature of this case that gets mixed up in the retelling. Paula did not disappear in the same general area as Mitty Rivers. Mitty Rivers was by my estimates, at least 1.5 miles to 2 miles farther north. And he was on a ridge opposite the Long Trail in a very remote area, walking deeper into the woods when he disappeared. And so it's much more likely that he could have gotten lost and died in a place so remote he couldn't be found. Paula was right down there on this road where there were houses and a well-marked trail, and it just seems a lot less likely that she could have done that, especially dressed as she was dressed. So we're kind of stuck in this limbo of did she get lost in the woods? Did she meet a bad person? And who was that person? And that's really where the case stalled. But there is a little bit of a postscript that I want to mention. In 1952, something odd was happening in the state attorney's office in Bennington County. The acting state attorney was this guy named John Hart. He was a lame duck. He wasn't interested in continuing. He was going to do something else with his life. He went away for a few weeks for Army Reserve training. And the governor appointed an interim named Reuben Levin. And during Reuben Levin's tenure, there seemed to be a real heating up of the Paula Welden case. And I can't quite get a timeline of these new events that happened, whether it all happened in that summer of 52 or whether it was leading up to this over a period of months. But essentially, there were 3 tips that came in. One of those tips came from people who had a female relative who had died. And they told police on her deathbed, she said, "My boyfriend murdered Paula Welden." Turns out her boyfriend was Fred Gaudette. He was described in one newspaper article as kind of a Casanova who had a number of girlfriends in the area. Someone else came forward, someone named Ike Smith, who was another lumberman, who said that Fred Gaudette was running around telling people he knew where Paula Welden was buried. They call Gaudette back in again, and they interrogate him based on one report, 3 hours, based on another report, 9 hours. And things get a little bit confusing. One account says he hadn't changed his story from when he got the lie detector test. Another account says he added something very perplexing to his story. Yes, he had seen Paula Welden that day. Yes, he and his girlfriend had a big fight. Yes, he had driven away in his car, but he hadn't driven away for 5 minutes. He'd driven away for 3 hours. He didn't get back till 7 o'clock, and he didn't know where he was during that 3 hours. He blacked out completely. And later that night, he drove his car into a tree around 11 o'clock at night during that snowstorm.
Wow. And he's got no alibi for the time?
Well, yeah. The alibi was essentially that he had been home with his girlfriend, and then he drove away, then he came back. But during that missing time, it seems like he didn't have an alibi. I think that's pretty interesting. There was a woman in Woodford who came forward and said that she'd had a dream about Paula Welden. And in her dream, Paula had gotten into a black car with a man who had assaulted her and killed her in the car. And then he buried her under the floor of a shack and put a wood stove directly over the grave. Well, Fred Gaudette had lived in a shack along that road. So all of this is very interesting. Gaudette's called in for questioning. They don't find anything damning enough to arrest him or keep him. But at the 11th hour, the acting state's attorney gets a search warrant to look through 2 properties along this stretch of road. And before the warrant can be executed, his term ends. And the existing state's attorney comes back to office, and the warrant is never executed. They say there's no evidence to dig up these houses. There's no evidence to hang on to Gaudette. It's nothing. So I don't know what to make of this, but I'm kind of stuck on it. And I have a couple of theories about what I think might be happening here. And one of those theories makes Levin look good. One of them makes him look bad. Let's start with the theory that makes him look bad. Levin was running for this position of state's attorney in 1952. And the Bennington Banner newspaper criticized the governor for appointing a guy who was running for the office that he was being appointed as interim for. And there seemed to be a suggestion that Levin was using this temporary appointment as a campaign strategy. And so you then have to ask yourself, did he gin up interest in the Welden case as a way of getting attention for himself to help his campaign for state's attorney? If you got a search warrant for a bunch of properties that you knew you wouldn't have time to execute, and that warrant was foisted off onto the other guy, if nothing was found, it wouldn't make you look bad. It would make the other guy look bad. So, and there is a little article in the paper about how Levin had gotten yelled at by a judge for being unprepared in court, that there was this little side item about how his paperwork wasn't put together. So you could paint a picture of this guy as someone who used the Welden case, who ginned up bad leads as a way of trying to get attention. The flip side, of course, is maybe he was following legitimate leads that the other state's attorney didn't want to follow for some unknown reason. You know, that these stories about the deathbed confession, the idea of Gaudette running around bragging about knowing where Paula Welden was buried. Incidentally, he said, even if I said that, I was probably joking. Well, you know, is that the kind of thing you joke about? But at the same time, with these cases, there are these people who insinuate themselves into cases to get attention. So this particular event of 1952 really has me kind of stuck. I'm really curious about the story behind this. And from what I gather, the police files that these other researchers have used don't go that far into the future. They end in 47 or 48. So if there are files for these, they might be in a separate record group. But here's one last thing. I may have mentioned this during the Midi Rivers case, that around 1950, a couple years after Paula disappears, as these other disappearances begin piling up, people around Bennington begin talking about something weird happening in the woods, people disappearing, and they use the term Lost Horizon, which is the 1930s novel about a group of people who are stranded in a mountainous area and they find a mystical place called Shangri-La. This is where we get the term Shangri-La popularized in society. One of those properties that was supposed to be searched for Paula Welden's remains was named Shangri-La. And that's just very interesting, isn't it?
What?
Yes. Yes, it was a little cottage. Now, I don't know whether this was a one-room shack that had a couple of bunk beds or whether it was whether an actual cottage. I don't know if it still exists or not. But that's an interesting little side item, isn't it?
So you don't know who owned that property?
I don't know. And it's an interesting, I was considering the issue of property research on this topic, and it's a challenging project, partly because it's a rural area. So it's likely that house numbers have changed, or that they may have not had house numbers at all. The second problem is that some of this land, especially farther up, was actually owned by a logging company, and the houses weren't on property per se, they were on leased land. So I think trying to track down who owned which houses when, it's not impossible, but I think it would require a lot of on-site research with property records that I have not had time or the capacity to do. And incidentally, a lot of these little houses are gone now. You can go to this stretch of the Long Trail on Harbor Road using Google Earth. And if you navigate up the road, I'd say most of the houses there today look like post-war sort of ranch houses, but there are lots of little older looking cottages that still exist today. So these buildings might have crumbled to dust by now, or they might still exist today. We don't know. But I think it's very unfortunate that the search warrant wasn't executed, because maybe it was a red herring, but it would have been another checkbox. in a case that's very perplexing. And so that's really where the investigation ended.
All right, we're going to take a quick break for commercial. And just a reminder, folks, that we will return at the end of this conversation with some final thoughts.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
The one area I didn't mention, because I didn't have a lot of time to look into it on my own, is Paula Welden's advisor, this guy named Dr. Kaiser, who doesn't show up in newspapers, but shows up only in police files accessed by other researchers. And this one researcher who had looked at these files and read through some eyewitness testimony, we can sort of put together a picture of a guy who might have had a clouded past. He had been at Middlebury College. He may have left Middlebury College under a cloud of sexual misconduct before he went to Bennington. He was Paula's advisor. There were stories that Paula spent a lot of time studying in the same classroom building where this guy practiced a musical instrument, and there was questions about whether they were meeting up there. He apparently sent some anonymous love notes to a student a year after Paula disappeared. So there may have been some issues of misconduct on his part, but it doesn't explain what Paula was doing up on the Long Trail that day. The police also mentioned in these police files a strange and puzzling piece of evidence they found in Paula's room, which were some bloody handkerchiefs. These are cotton handkerchiefs used for wiping your nose that had blood on them, and they had been sort of hidden away, like kind of fallen down behind Paula's radio. No one could understand the significance of these. Was she suffering from a physical ailment that would cause her to bleed? What might that ailment have been, or an injury? We can speculate a bunch of different directions about that. But that was something which also didn't make it in the papers for obvious reasons, but also seems like a dead end. And it doesn't explain much to us about the Long Trail and why she might have been there. So there are all these interesting, strange directions to go in. The last two things I want to leave with are these. The first is that one of the legacies of the Welden case is the creation of the Vermont State Police. As I'd mentioned, there was no state police force. And so all the searches that happened were at the local level. They were volunteers. They were kind of ad hoc. And Paula Welden's father was really very outspoken about how deplorable the lack of resources were. Not a lack of willingness, but a lack of manpower, organization, et cetera. He spoke out at a news conference in front of reporters about this. And because of him speaking out, and I think because of efforts by some of the sort of high status people on the board of Bennington College, it spurred the authorities in Vermont to create a state police force that year. So part of why Vermont has a state police is because of Paula Welden and the fact that she was never found. The second thing, which I think is very interesting, is that the novelist Shirley Jackson wrote about this case. She's known for writing The Haunting of Hill House and writing a famous short story called The Lottery. She was living in Bennington when this happened. Her husband taught at Bennington College. And in 1950, she wrote a novel called Hangs a Man, which is about a young woman at a progressive women's college in New England who is struggling to find herself. I won't give away the plot, because if people want to read it, they should read it. It's a great book. One biographer of Jackson doubted whether this was about Paula Welden, but if you read the book, it's so obviously about her. The character has a very different fate than Paula does. In some ways, I think Jackson was kind of inventing a future for Paula Welden by writing this book. But it's a very interesting and intriguing book. And there were some other short stories and a lot of nonfiction pieces published in everything from like Fate magazine, local newspapers about the Welden case. And then there was a movie, was it HBO or Netflix? I can't remember, but one of the streaming services starring Elizabeth Moss, called Shirley, which was about this very event in Shirley Jackson's life, that time where she's living in Bennington and Paula Welden has disappeared. And that movie gives a narrative as to what might have happened to Paula Welden. So she shows up in these literary works as well, really capturing people's imaginations. The last two things, 1953, a box of human bones was found in the town dump in Pownell. And they said, is this Paula Welden? Turns out it was a carelessly discarded cadaver from a medical school. I think it's a very weird story about some of the weird stuff that comes up in these stories. But some local doctor had a skeleton in his office. He moved out. He left the skeleton behind in a box. The new homeowner threw it out, ends up in the landfill, and they find it. In 1968, there was a hospital being built in North Adams, Massachusetts, and they uncovered human remains during the construction of the hospital. And the newspaper article says, is this Paula Welden, who disappeared, 22 years ago? So she was on people's minds even decades later when human remains would turn up, whether that was a murder case or a historical burial that was found. She really kind of haunted, I think, the minds of people in the area and journalists who studied this case. And she's been written about by a number of people through the years. So I think this case has really captured people's imaginations, but we don't, I think, have a satisfactory conclusion as to what happened to her.
It's definitely captured our imaginations here, and what an amazing job retelling all those details in such meticulous order. Thank you so much for that. I got a few questions if we have some time for a few questions. First of all, another thank you for connecting Shirley Jackson to Paula Welden. I never made that connection, and I've read that, and I saw the movie, and it never, Welden wasn't on my radar when I read that book, but very cool. No better author to maybe indicate that no better author to write about Paula than Shirley Jackson. Fred Gaudette. 2 questions on him real quick. What kind of car did he have? And that shack that you mentioned, which coincided with the dream, does that still exist? Do you know?
On the first part, I don't know the model of vehicle. I believe he drove a truck. If you read these articles, there are discrepancies across time. You might have one article saying the person drives a truck, one article saying he drives a car. So I don't know exactly what the vehicle is that he drove. As far as the shack is concerned, that's a mystery. I'm curious about whether one of the shacks that was listed in the search warrant was his house. My understanding from one of these newspaper articles is that there had been a search at his house, but the impression I got was that it was one of those voluntary searches where police just kind of wander around and look at things. They're not like looking under the porch or in the cellar or anything like that. So I don't know if that shack still exists or not. Because it was described as a shack, I'm going to guess not. I think these were pretty rudimentary structures, those little hunters' lodges, and I don't think they were meant to last very, very long. So I would guess it's probably not there any longer. But it is, that whole angle does provide an interesting solution. If we think about the buildings that were on that road and how they were used, some of those were hunting lodges that were occupied, some were unoccupied, some were weekend cottages. Somebody who lived on that road would know which of those buildings was occupied and which ones weren't occupied. And if they'd harmed somebody, let's say in their car, and they wanted to make that person disappear, and they knew, the people that live in that house are only summer people, you could take that body and hide it in the cellar or under the porch or in the backyard, and nobody would know and nobody would see. And that would explain Paula's complete disappearance. So I think we have to accept the possibility that she is still somewhere along that stretch of the road. But that really limits the number of people who could be involved in the disappearance.
And the people who saw or gave the report that they saw Paula the day before, did they ever describe what her attitude was? Was there any indication there?
If they indicated at all, they said she was acting normally. Lewis Knapp said she was fine. He picked her up in his car. He talked with her. He said her mood was fine. She was quiet. She didn't talk for much of the way, but she seemed pleasant enough. She said, thank you for the ride. So nobody observed anything out of the ordinary about her behavior or her demeanor.
Right. Seemed like she was possibly a little depressed leading up to this. And I believe it was Lori Lamothe on that video, that presentation done at the library, which is pretty cool to check out. I believe she said that this Dr. Kaiser fellow met with Paula the day before as her advisor. They would meet occasionally, but I guess one of them was the day before. But I liked your point of, she made it to the long trail. Like if if this guy Kaiser was a true suspect, he would have been there, or she wouldn't have gone to the long trail, and there would have been probably some confusion of her getting there at all. But there were so many witnesses seeing her out there that it seems like he's not the right direction.
It's an interesting question. Paula's roommate and her parents thought that she went for a walk that day. A lot of people who have talked about this story subsequently have, I think, been very puzzled over her reasons for going out there. It was late in the day. She wasn't dressed for the weather. I don't think those are unreasonable questions, but we're talking about somebody who's 18. She's conscientious. She's level-headed. But let's sort of put this into perspective. Look, New England is not a great place to be on December the 1st. I mean, it's gray and rainy and miserable. If you're in a bad mood, it's not going to help your mood. Sundays are difficult days for people who are depressed and anxious sometimes. I can imagine Paula kind of moping around her dorm and at some point saying, to hell with it, I'm going to go for a walk. I don't care if it's getting late. One of the things that comes up for me that I have not been able to verify either way is, did she have a flashlight with her? She and her roommate had gone camping in the past. The D-cell battery flashlights were available in the 40s. It's something that a person who does outdoor activity would have. If she'd had a flashlight with her, the lateness of the hour would be a little bit less perplexing. You don't necessarily want to be in the woods with a flashlight, but it would have at least shown that, yeah, she's gonna be out in the dark. She knows she's gonna be out in the dark, and maybe she figured she'd use the flashlight to flag down a car to give her a ride back to campus again. I haven't seen any evidence of that. One of the articles I read indicated there may have been a pre-existing plan to go out to the Long Trail that day, that some of her friends had suggested going on a hike on Thanksgiving Day. But those friends ended up leaving town and the hike never happened. So it seems reasonable to me that someone who had a plan to go to the Long Trail at some point, who was outdoorsy, who was interested in botany and would have spent time walking in the woods, that she would have decided to go out and wing it. Maybe it was incautious of her to go out late when a cold front was coming through, but it wasn't so unusual that I think there was something weird about her trip out there. I think she went for a Sunday walk.
Yeah, and it's not like she could look down on her cell phone and see the weather app and be like, oh, it's going to get colder tonight. I mean, how would she have known what the weather was going to be like based on newspaper?
The newspapers would have, and there probably would have been weather reports on the radio. There are some indications that some people in the region expected the cold front to come through that day, which means they would have read it in the newspaper or the radio. But again, like you said, she's not necessarily going to be reading the newspaper that morning. And maybe she assumed the weather was going to be fine and didn't know it was going to be getting cold that night. Or maybe she assumed it was going to be cold at midnight and not at 6 or 7 p.m.
Interesting. Okay. Is there any report of any clothing that she left behind that would have been more suitable for walking out in inclement weather?
No, by all accounts, she was not dressed for cold weather. No hat, no mittens. They don't describe what kind of shirt she would have been wearing underneath the overalls, but it doesn't sound like she was really dressed for anything other than a walk on a cloudy 40-degree day. If people have questions about money, she did have her wallet with her, but she had maybe 10 or 20 bucks in her wallet. So again, the idea of her stashing money somewhere doesn't make sense. And I think that let's think about the idea of her meeting somebody. She's going to hitchhike 5 miles to meet somebody in the woods at 4:30 at 5 o'clock at dusk up a trail. Like that doesn't make sense to me. Let's just say that she was having a relationship with somebody on campus. Why not meet on campus? If you're being clandestine about it, go out to the highway and he picks you up on the highway in his car and you drive somewhere from there. You're not gonna ask somebody to hitchhike. Come and hitchhike 5 miles and meet me in the woods. No one's gonna do that. So no, I think her walk in the woods is very unrelated to any of this other stuff going on in her life.
What is the time difference? And you did mention a little bit about Mitty Rivers and where he disappeared, but what is the time difference between the two, and like how far away from each other are those disappearances?
Paula disappeared a year and about 2 weeks, a year and a couple of weeks after Mitty Rivers. I don't remember exactly when Rivers disappeared, but by recollection, it was later in the autumn in November. So similar time of year, a little bit later. Rivers would have been farther north and west. So if you can sort of picture in your mind's eye a country road leading north toward Glastenbury Mountain, a couple of miles, the public road comes to an end. The long trail continues going up, up, up. Farther up on that trail, maybe a mile or two north of where Paula was seen, was where Mitty Rivers' cabin was. And he was on the ridge opposite to the west, walking in a northwesterly direction. So he was quite a distance away from Paula in a much more isolated, woodsy place. And from what I've been able to read, there really weren't a lot of marked trails in that area. So he was a significant difference away. Some people suspect he might have actually ended up on the western slope of Glastenbury Mountain, which was a couple of miles north of here. So he was in the vicinity, but not close by any means.
With the media coverage of his disappearance, is it plausible to think that Paula had heard about his disappearance? Was she perhaps interested in this area that was starting to gain this reputation, or was there no reputation for the triangle yet?
I don't think there was any reputation yet. I have not seen evidence of a reputation. Some authors have written that the area had a reputation for being sort of spooky or haunted going back generations. What I've seen in newspapers indicate that it did not, or at least if it did, it wasn't being reported. Paula would almost certainly have heard about the Mitty Rivers case. Shirley Jackson heard about the Mitty Rivers case when it happened because she referenced it either in her notes or one of her writings. So Paula would have known about this. But at the time, I think the Mitty Rivers case was just a sad story of a hunter who got lost. I don't know that there was any air of mystery about it. The Long Trail was and is a very popular place. As we can see, there is this mystery couple that's spending the night there in a hiker's shelter. There was another report of a group of servicemen who were hiking on the trail that day. There were a variety of people on the trail that day. So I think it was just that Paula was interested in outdoors activities, and it seemed like a nice place to go for a hike, a popular place to go.
And in your opinion, it seems like, well, obviously she made it to the trail, but she possibly got into a car to get back towards school. Is that your guess, I guess?
I'm torn. I guess if I had to make a determination of what I think happened, I think the foul play theory is probably the better of all the theories. But I don't know. I find it very interesting that so many people saw her along the way. There might have been people who saw her who did her harm. There could have been a local person who did this. So I don't think it's implausible that somebody harmed her along the trail and put her in a basement or a barn or a backyard or something along there. But I do think that the path of least resistance, or so to speak, is that she walked back down the trail. It was getting dark enough that the people who saw her walking up would likely not have seen her walking down. You know, if you're in your house and it's dark outside and your lights are on, you're not going to see someone walking by on the road. Whereas an hour earlier you would. And people are going to be indoors at that point eating dinner. So I think it's very likely she walked down that same road, past those houses, nobody saw her, goes out to Route 9 and sticks out her thumb and gets in the car with the wrong person. I don't think that's implausible. And as I said, that's what her parents thought happened. That was, I think, in their sort of, you can imagine they probably spent a lot of sleepless nights trying to imagine scenarios. That was the one that her father said he thought was most likely, that it wasn't, that there weren't any mysterious, movements. It was just her heading back down and hitchhiking with the wrong person. So I think that's probably as good a guess as any. And if that happened, God only knows where she ended up.
Right. And the search efforts were great in that area, it seems.
Yeah, they were really thorough about it. You know, they used a similar tactic they used with Mitty Rivers, which is they dropped confetti. Searchers would carry bags of confetti and they would drop it in areas they searched. So when you went back the following spring, you could see what had been searched. Also in the Welden case, they used aircraft. They used low-flying airplanes. And remember, the trees are bare, there's snow on the ground. They flew airplanes all around the highway trying to look for a body. Didn't see anything. They used a helicopter. Helicopters were sort of new technology at that point. And so the impression I get was that the search was about as exhaustive as it could have been. And I think what Mr. Welden was criticizing was not that the search wasn't thorough, but that the resources available were not enough to do a really well-organized, structured search. The kind of resources a centralized kind of state police officer to provide. But I think that most people would agree that it was as thorough as the resources would have allowed it to be. So again, it's not impossible that she ended up off the trail, but if that happened, there isn't a really good scenario for where she would have gone. The only outlier explanation, and this is the one I mentioned with Mitty Rivers, was this a planned disappearance? Not to run away to start a new life, but to go away to die somewhere in the woods. There's no evidence she was suicidal or self-destructive. Yeah, she was down in the dumps. How many college sophomores aren't? When you're not getting along with your mom and dad, maybe, or you're struggling with something at school, maybe there was something worse going on in her life. But nobody who knew Paula seemed to think that she was self-destructive. And if you read newspaper articles from this era, if somebody was self-destructive, that was often mentioned in the article. This person may be suicidal. They didn't seem shy about talking about people's private struggles in the newspapers back then. The articles in newspapers aren't saying that about her. She was a normal college student who went for a walk. So I don't think that she intentionally wandered off into the woods. There's no evidence that she would have.
And do you have any insight or anything that's been written about how the other states might have helped with this? Because the area of Bennington, Vermont, right, that's right on the corner of Vermont, New York, and Massachusetts. So within 20 minutes or so, she could have been in another state if she had gotten into a car with somebody. Was there any cooperation or any non-cooperation with the other states?
Other state police forces were notified, and the Connecticut State Police actually assisted with the search because she was from Connecticut. Her father, however, when he was in some of his travels during the search, he got pulled over for speeding in Pittsfield. And the police officer who pulled him over hadn't heard about his daughter's missing persons case. And Pittsfield's not that far from Bennington. So yes, it sounds like officials in Bennington reached out to other police forces in the area, but it sounds like those efforts were not as coordinated as they could have been. So I think it's likely that there were police forces. I mean, certainly if there were state police, they would have gotten the memo, but whether or not the small towns around got the memo, it's a little bit unclear. There was one interesting detail that came up in this case that it sounds like journalists found. I mentioned that maroon-colored mercury. At some point in December, the police in Duanesburg, New York, the journalists discovered that police in Duanesburg, New York, about 70 miles west, found a mercury automobile fitting that description, stripped and burned. And they traced it to a stolen car report from Troy, New York in November. So car is stolen in Troy, New York in November. Paula disappears December the 1st. Mercury is seen along this stretch of road. And then a few weeks later, Mercury is found burned in Duanesburg. Is that the same Mercury? It's a long shot. I mean, it's 70 miles difference. There might have been a lot of maroon cars around, but it's interesting. It's a question mark. Is there some connection there? So clearly, journalists were interfacing with police forces outside the region and getting information. But I don't think it was as structured or as well blanketed communication as it could have been or should have been. That's what Mr. Welden thought anyway. Gotcha.
Now, is there anything, in your opinion, that can be done today that can help, like with DNA or any sort of, I don't know, sourcing, forensics, anything like that?
A couple of ideas. One of these researchers mentioned those bloody handkerchiefs, which I think are startling and strange. If those still exist, and she remarked in her lecture that she was not able to track them down, but if they still existed, could they be tested for DNA potentially? Test the blood, see if it was Paula's or somebody else's, try to get to the bottom of what that strange thing was. But I think a lot about the information regarding this case. I was thinking about this the other week, and I thought, if I could get all of the newspaper articles about Paula Welden and turn them into text files and put them into a large language model like ChatGPT, And then maybe if I could get the police files, 600 plus pages, scan those, turn them into a text file, put them into see what AI has to say about this. The one thing, I've been working with AI at work a little bit. The one thing, it's not always ready for prime time when it comes to getting you facts, okay? But it's really good at summarizing information. It's really, really good at taking complex, multi-paragraph blocks of text and accurately condensing them down to one paragraph. That's one thing I think would be really interesting to look at and see, are there patterns that we aren't discerning in these huge volumes of information? Are there names that show up? Same could be said for searching newspaper articles about some of these people. If you could find a person involved with this case who shows up somewhere else involved in criminal activity, you can then go back to that person. So there's a lot of documentation and a lot of search tools, both from the database perspective of databases like newspapers.com, public records databases, but then we're having this new emerging technology, which is going to help us summarize or synthesize information. I think those are interesting avenues to explore in a case like this. As far as actual forensics, well, if someone could track down where those houses were along that road and see if they still exist, that's always an option, but it's all private property. And I wouldn't blame anybody who lived in one of those places to say no thanks. I'd rather not dredge up the past, literally or figuratively. But if she were harmed along the trail and buried there, she'd still be there somewhere.
I think that's a call to action to our listeners. If anybody wants to give you a hand in scanning 600 pages of police documents.
Well, I'd have to get access to them first. I did some digging. I think I kind of know where they were and how I go about getting access to them. I'm not sure whether I'd be granted access or not, but I do think that's an interesting area to explore. And yeah, obviously, if people were interested in looking at newspapers, if you go to newspapers.com, when people have quote unquote clipped an article, there'll be a little blue outline around the article, and all the articles about Paula Welden have been clipped multiple times by many, many people through the years. So there's lots of, I think, people out there who are interested in this case who are saving information about it. And one of the things about the case that's worth mentioning as we kind of wrap this conversation up is this: 3 years to the day after Paula Welden disappeared, an elderly man named James Tedford gets on a bus in northern Vermont, bound for Bennington, and he never arrives. And he becomes the third person in this series of mysterious disappearances.
All right, and we're back here for final thoughts after the conversation with Ross. Wow. He has a way of going through these stories chronologically and really doing a great job. And so we're really only needed in like the second half of this conversation when we're kind of just asking some follow-ups and more specifics, but he really goes through without being prompted. So big thanks to Ross for this research and appearing with us here in this episode about Paula Welden.
Yeah, totally. I love these style of episodes because the more current episodes that we produce and cover these missing persons, there's so many details that are in the public and changing in real time. So there's more of that start and stopping. Even when we have a very well-researched document in front of us, we'll contribute to it and we'll give our theories because there's a lot more that we have to theorize on. Something that's happened so long ago, something that's happened, in the 1940s has had extensive coverage. So that enables Ross to give the story to us in the first half. Then we just sort of mark our questions down as he's going, and the second half is us asking the questions and him giving these incredibly thoughtful and articulate answers, which is like a perfect missing episode for a historical disappearance, not a current disappearance, a historical disappearance. You get the story, and then all the questions that you had, you and I, Tim, probably are having the same questions as a listener, so we get to ask those, which I love. But I have no clue what happened to Paula.
Yeah. So it is mysterious. As we said in the intro, she made it to the long trail, which is, I guess, a good clue that, say, her advisor at Bennington College, this guy, Mr. Kaiser, probably wasn't the culprit here. But if we never had proof that she left campus, then I would have been eyeballing that guy because he seemed to be a bit inappropriate with some of the students. Also, just want to give a big shout out to Michael C. Dooling, Lori Lamothe, and Erin Kate Ryan. They gave a really cool presentation, and there's a link in the show notes. It's the Vimeo link, but it's a really cool presentation done at a library, I think around the time of the pandemic, maybe 2020, but they went over a lot of research that they had done, and they spoke a bit about this Kaiser fellow. But in the conversation with Ross, it sure seems like Fred Gadet is more of a suspect in this case than Paula's advisor there, Kaiser. So a couple of things jumped out to me immediately here when wondering where Paula could have went. First thing is, she worked her shift the morning of her disappearance. So I feel like she probably wasn't planning on disappearing, right? I mean, it's not like you got handed cash, most likely.
Right.
I guess I don't know. I think she worked at the cafeteria at the college. I doubt she was handed cash right then, and she apparently had some money on her anyway, as Ross mentioned. But just the fact that she worked that shift, she was getting up late. She overslept. Her roommate pushed her out of bed. They laughed about it. And then she went to work, worked her shift, and then got dressed for this hike. And she also never signed the book at Bennington College that students were supposed to sign if you were going to return after 11 p.m. So she didn't intend to be gone after 11 p.m. unless she intended to be gone forever. But as we just said, I think that's unlikely due to her, having a normal day up until that point.
Yeah, almost like extraordinarily normal. She didn't take any extra money with her. She didn't properly prepare her wardrobe for any conditions that would keep her out beyond, a certain time. Like you said, she didn't sign out indicating that she would be back after 11 p.m. And she really wasn't prepared to do any extra walking, any extra hiking, anything beyond maybe a couple of hours. And that's what everybody is saying. That's what all of the accounts are pointing to.
Right. So there were several sightings of Paula, and including someone who drove her. So she hitchhiked to the long trail, and police spoke with the person who drove her, and she was seen after that too. So several sightings of her, and then it got dark, and then there weren't any more sightings of her after dusk. But this guy, Fred Gadet, who had a cabin in that area, had an argument with his girlfriend, seems like a bit of a hothead. Ross described him as sort of a Casanova later in the episode. Also described him as someone who spread rumors about himself having done something or buried Paula Welden, which is weird. However, we've heard that in other cases, notably Maura Murray's case. There's several rumors like that come up, and I believe most of those people who spread those rumors are probably not guilty of anything. They're just kind of making jokes, I guess. Kind of not a great joke to make, but
yeah, gallows humor, I guess. But
yeah, it is. Yeah. But this guy Gadet seems more suspicious than everyone else in this story.
Right, including the person that picked her up. Apparently he was a local contractor who had picked her up and drove her as far as he could drive her. He dropped her off at his home. So he drove her up to his home, and then she continued on. And that didn't seem to raise any eyebrows with anybody that this would happen. Even Ross said that hitchhiking back then was pretty common. And this guy, I think his last name was Knapp. I think Ross said his last name was Knapp. He had picked her up. It probably wasn't the first hitchhiker that he picked up. And I don't know what kind of investigation went into anybody who saw him after the fact, like at his home, but he definitely is a lot less suspicious than Gadet.
Yeah, good point about the witnesses who saw him or Paula at home when he pulled in. But it sounds like she was with him at that point, and then she kept going on her hike, and he went home. So it really doesn't seem suspicious when you're talking about Mr. Knapp there.
Right.
And really, like, what else could have happened, right? I guess she could have gotten lost in the woods. We do know there were extensive searches. Ross mentioned the confetti that they used.
Oh, yeah. I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, to show that they searched an area. Now, we've also heard people stepping over bodies in the woods and not seeing them. So it's possible that she was there, but not seen, even though they did do extensive searches. But this one seems, again, more suspicious. Like, the Long Trail is a pretty popular trail. It's apparently very wide. It's not like Trenny Gibson's story or Mitty Rivers' story, where you're in more thick brush, smaller trails, things like that. The Long Trail, pretty popular and more wide. So to have gotten lost seems unlikely, unless, again, she was intending to do that. But I don't think there was any real reason to believe she was suicidal or trying to start a new life. Seems like she was going for a walk in the woods.
Yeah, I mean, there are accounts that she was acting a bit depressed, maybe off from her like usual behavior, but we have to just look at the fact that she's, you know, an 18-year-old young woman who is trying to figure things out, and we have to put ourselves back, you know, in that mindset. And I mean, most people even beyond 18 years old have days where they act depressed. They have things that have happened outside of their control that bring them down. And the idea that she would walk into the woods to commit suicide on a very popular trail after being picked up by a hitchhiker, like, she's hitchhiking. She's putting herself out there to hitchhike. If she was going to, I'm thinking, if she was going to go into the woods to commit suicide, she's just going into the woods. You know, she's just walking into the woods to sit down and let the elements take over or something. I don't think she's getting a ride. I don't think she's getting I don't know if she's hitchhiking. Again, I'm not sure like what the area was like before entering the trail.
Right. If you're going to try to commit suicide in the woods, that could be any woods, right? And also, you know, she didn't have anything on her person that we know of that would have assisted her in committing suicide. No weapons, no gun, no knife, no pills, nothing like that we know of. So even if she did sit down, she's not going to die unless she's attacked by wild animals or something.
I don't know how long it would take for hypothermia to kick in at that point, but that's like not the best method of suicide.
Yeah.
And I don't laugh because it's funny. I just laugh because, you know, that's something that needs to be checked, I think, off the list of what happened to Paula Welden.
Yeah, good point about hypothermia, though. I did forget that that it did start snowing that evening. It was December 1st in New England. So it wasn't warm, and it did start snowing. So that is a good point.
But how does she know that? I think we talked to Ross about this. It's not like she had a weather app that she could check out when it's going to start snowing. You know, she could have looked at the newspaper from the day before or maybe that morning and, you know, maybe sort of garnered some sort of a idea of what the weather was going to be hour by hour. But if you've committed yourself to taking your own life, there have to be so many other ways that are easier and quicker.
So I think what this leaves us with is this guy, Fred Gadet, or there could be an unknown suspect if she left the Long Trail that night and decided to hitchhike back to campus. She obviously didn't make it, but then the question would be, whose car did she get into for that ride back to campus? We don't know. There's no answer that we have there. We don't even know that she ever did attempt to hitchhike back to campus, but that's where my head's at. If she did, she got into the car of someone who did her harm.
And somebody who has the knowledge and the wherewithal and the ability to hide a body completely without any trace of it being found. And I'm not pointing fingers at Fred Gadet, but he was very familiar. He was a lumberjack, right? He was very familiar with the wilderness. He had a cabin. He probably knew where there were areas in the wilderness that had maybe caves, maybe lumber yards that you could stash something in that wouldn't be located for a while. He had a lot more knowledge than any other person that comes into the story about areas that aren't typically traversed by foot, by the common person. And he was a hothead. He had an argument with his girlfriend that Welden witnessed, right? Didn't Paula, wasn't she there? Didn't she walk by when it happened?
I believe after. I think what happened was Goddard's girlfriend was talking to two men that she knew who were in their car out in front of her house.
Right.
And she went back inside, and then her boyfriend accused her of cheating on him with, I guess, one of those guys or whoever. And then that's what started the fight. And then he took off to sort of blow off some steam, got in his car and drove around, but apparently lied about where he was during those hours. It was, I think, initially believed that he returned pretty quickly to his girlfriend's house, but later it was learned that he actually was kind of unaccounted for about 3 hours.
Right.
Before he came back to his girlfriend's place.
And also heading in the direction when he went to blow off steam of where Paula was walking, right?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah. And
then there was some kind of deathbed confession by a girlfriend of this Goddard who said that her boyfriend killed Paula Welden. I'm not sure. I think I'm a little unclear if it was the same girlfriend or a different girlfriend, but either way, he seemed to be spreading these rumors about himself.
And he also told people in town that he had knowledge of where she was buried within 100 feet.
Right. So it all adds up to kind of a suspicious character. Again, kind of familiar in some of these missing persons cases that we've covered for years. Kind of a familiar archetype, I guess. Reminds me of someone in Maura Murray's case specifically. But in that case, there's never been any concrete evidence despite people suspecting him. And in this case, it's kind of the same thing. This guy seems to be the most likely suspect if Paula was met with foul play, but also we don't know if she got into somebody's car that did her harm that wasn't Fred Gadet,
Yeah. Hard to imagine that, though. Again, in 2025, and even in Maura Murray's case, obviously, it's 2004, there are hundreds of cars, hundreds of thousands of cars, people driving. This happened in the 40s, 1940s. Like, the automobile wasn't as prevalent. So I just feel like it would raise a lot more eyebrows if someone else managed to be in the area with their vehicle and picked her up and managed to get rid of the body without a trace. I'm saying it's not as like needle in the haystack as it is today with just like so many vehicles everywhere all the time.
Right. I also wonder if Paula went missing, say, in 1976 instead of 1946 and the same story. Like, I feel like we would think she definitely got killed by hitchhiking, by whoever's car, because I just think that was a more common danger later. Obviously, after highways were built and things like that, there has been much research done on why serial killers seem to have peaked in really the 70s and 80s. But I think like hitchhiking was part of it, like the culture of hitchhiking back in the 40s wasn't really known as dangerous, was more normal than anything. And then like just like 20, 30 years later, it was a very high risk thing to do.
Right, because in the meantime, you've just increased the number of ways people will want to take advantage of other people. Now they have a vehicle. Now they can become predators, like active predators.
Absolutely.
But something good did come of this.
Yeah, the Vermont State Police.
Yes. Always love when this happens.
Yeah, very cool. Especially, we kind of know some Vermont State Police, or former at least, and Paula Welden's case really launched the Vermont State Police. So that's a pretty cool part of the story.
Yep. And I just want to press on that a little bit more. It wasn't even a year after Paula's disappearance that the Vermont legislature decided that the state police was necessary. So they moved into action pretty quick. Think about how much red tape it takes to just do anything, how much bureaucracy there is. They identified the problem, and it was partially because of Paula's father. He was very active and vocal in saying that there just wasn't enough organization here. There needs to be something more. And they got their shit together and they created the Vermont State Police. That's absolutely fantastic.
And it seems like about 20 other states had established their own state police departments before Vermont did. So I guess it was going to take some kind of unsolved case to do it. But Paula's is the one that did it officially in 1947.
So again, I know we did thank Ross in the intro. We can't thank him enough for doing this. He takes time out of his day to do this for us, putting together all of the research. And I don't know if the dude practices in front of a mirror or something, or in front of his family, but he nails it as a one-man show, and it's impressive. It's impressive to see someone do that. And it's clear, like, I think I texted you or I asked you, like, he's not reading anything. He's not reading anything, right? This is just coming.
No.
You can tell when someone's reading something. And we've often heard people like shuffle pages or like click their mouse or something, and that's totally cool if they want to have their bullet points written down. They want to make sure they hit them all. But he's hitting them all from his. He might be a savant. Like, that's impressive.
Yeah.
So big thanks to him for doing that.
Yeah, big thanks to Ross. Yeah, it seems like he digests these articles and really keeps the information in his head. Sometimes the details float out of my head. But the next time we'll be speaking with Ross, we'll speak with him about the disappearance of 68-year-old James Tedford, who went missing on December 1st, 1949. So that'll be another case in this Bennington Triangle group of disappearances that we will speak with Ross about.
Yes. And real quick, if anyone's still listening, he does mention Shirley Jackson's book, Hangs a Man. If anyone out there has not read that book, it's a really quick read, or you can listen to the audio version wherever you get your audiobooks. It's excellent. Shirley Jackson nails it. Yeah, she's definitely talking about Paula Welden in this, but she gives her Shirley Jackson, spin, that Shirley Jackson quality. Definitely recommend that book. I'm glad that he brought it up because I kind of forgot about it.
All right, everyone. Thanks a lot for listening. Please follow us on social media at MissingCSM, and we will be back next week with more.